This is the English Wikipedia page for the Brno transit network, or rather Trams in Brno, or the Brno tramway network, which is part of Dopravní podnik města Brna, which is the Brno Transit Authority. And they also operate trolley buses and even ferry boats actually on the reservoir. So they're pretty extensive, like the Prague Transit Authority, DPMB. And down here is a list of the tram classes used. Interestingly enough, the Tatra T3 is still the most common class after all these years, 71 of them in service as of the time this page was last updated. They also have a fleet of K2s, which are like T3s, but they're articulated, see? And these were built starting in 1966 and discontinued in 1983, being replaced by the KT4 and the KT8. And then they have the Škodas here, the 03 and the 13. But they also have these rather unusual tram classes, or at least they appear to be unusual until you look at what their actual situation is. Basically, they are built in quantity, but not for Prague. So they're used in Brno, in Most, in Olomouc, in Ostrava, and Pilsen. So pretty much every notable tram system in the Czech Republic except for Liberec. And they're also exported, so there are some of them in Moscow, some of them in Košice, and some of them in Tashkent. The Vario LF was introduced in 2004, and according to this webpage, they're still in production. And they look reasonably modern. This is in Brno. And they're very, very common in Brno, although not as common as you might assume. 32 of them in service, whereas there are 49 Škoda 13Ts and 71 Tatra T3s and so on. And they're made by a consortium. If we look at the Czech webpage again here for specifically the Vario LF, and they're built by the Alliance TW team, or I guess it would be Dvojtové team, in Krnov, which is in turn owned by a company called KIOS. And they cooperate with Prago IMEX and VKV Praha. I'm probably would be VKV Praha. I'm probably mispronouncing these. But it's a consortium, and when you look carefully at one of their trams, actually this one doesn't have the logo. If we look at a different one, actually we can look at their newer tram, built since 2012 as a prototype and since 2019 in production. This one's in Pilsen, and there's the logo, the TWT logo. You can see on the nose of this Evo 2, which is their newest tram model. Not used in Prague, but used in Brno, Liberec, Most, and Pilsen. But I just wanted to go over these to point out that they exist, because I do have some videos of them, as you'll see. So I guess we'll move on to the next thing. I put together this PowerPoint presentation to try and simplify the various mergers in the history of Prague trams, and Czech trams generally. We'll see that in a minute. So you have the Ringhofer Company, or the Ringhofer Works, in 1852, which actually predates the Prague tram system, so they built other heavy machinery before that. Their first tram production was in 1874, actually, in preparation for the Prague transit system opening in the following year. They've also built trams, obviously, for Brno and other cities. And in 1936, they merged into Tatra, or merged with Tatra, because the Tatra brand name, as I'm saying down here, survived, independent of Ringhofer. And then Brightfield, Danek and Spol, or and Company, that means, were a locomotive builder. Českomoravska built, if I'm remembering right, mostly heavy machinery, and Kolben were similar. So they merged to form Czech AD in 1927, and after World War II, Czech AD and Ringhofer were merged, along with Tatra. And they changed their official name to Czech AD Tatra in 1963, although really they had been working together for a very long time. And after the 1989 revolution, within 10 years, Czech AD Tatra were broken up. Tatra Trucks became basically the company it is now, producing trucks only, in 1999. And tram building and some of the train building, if I'm remembering right, were moved to Zličín, and that survived under Siemens operation until 2009. Although, as I've said, they didn't build any trams there, mostly heavy rail equipment, actually. If we jump over to what the Prague transit system bought instead, they bought Škodas, essentially, from 2005 or so, rather than Tatras. So Škoda had a long history. It started in 1859 as primarily a heavy machinery and railroad works, you could argue. Lauren and Clement, the car company, ended up becoming Škoda Auto after they were merged into Škoda in 1925. Škoda, after the 1989 revolution, ended up becoming Škoda Transportation, whereas Škoda Auto went to Volkswagen, and Škoda Auto survives today as part of the Volkswagen Group. Meanwhile, there was this long series of railway works in Studenka under various names going back to 1900, and finally that ended up under the control of the former Czech AD Thrall and MSV Metal Studenka, which became Škoda Vagonka in Studenka. Although this works doesn't build any trams at present, it only builds electric multiple units. So this is almost tangential, but you'll see in 2 more slides why this is kind of a strange development, because they are involved in tram building in another capacity. Innoconn, I mentioned this company earlier, they built some trams, but not again for Prague. They have built for Ostrava, among other cities. But they also are involved with Škoda. Škoda didn't actually merge into Innoconn, but they've collaborated on the development of Innoconn trams, as I was discussing earlier. Now, a more significant new company is Alliancie Ted Vojtové, or TW Team, or TWT, and they can trace their ancestry way back to the Krnovské opravní a strojní railway works primarily. And Prago Imex work on trams in a maintenance capacity for Prague, but they don't independently build trams except as part of TWT. And I mentioned Studenka earlier. Studenka ended up partly in the hands of Škoda and partly in the hands of VKV Praha. So in spite of the name, and in spite of Studenka being closer to Ostrava than Prague, VKV run their tram manufacturing operations here with TWT, because TWT wasn't formed by a merger, it's more of a consortium of these 3 companies, Krnovské, Prago Imex, or Prago Mex, and VKV Praha. VKV Praha, weirdly enough, specialize in train toilets, so this is a very, very strange business for them to be involved in, but they are a railway maintenance contractor. So the fact that they operate works makes some sense, given that they're involved in tram manufacturing. So, now that you've watched my very brief description of tram company mergers, we can move on to the next subject. Basically, I want to look at some of the other resources online.